Coming up on Network Africa, President Pierre Nkurunziza of Burundi gives Burundian officials a deadline to find the killers of the late Army General Athanase Kairuza. Then we have the latest regarding the fuel crisis, with the Minister of Petroleum giving Nigerians an apology about the situation. And later, researchers help elephants stay off Kenyan farms. This is Network Africa. Hello and welcome to Network Africa. I am Adeshewa Josh. On the program today, we'll be taking a closer look at happenings in East Africa. As violence lingers in Burundi, President Nkurunziza has condemned the killing of a senior army officer who was shot along with his wife and bodyguard. According to reports, Brigadier General Athanase Kairuza, who was a military advisor in the office of the vice president, was dropping his child in school when his car was attacked yesterday. Tit-for-tat attacks between Nkurunziza's security forces and his opponents have escalated since April 2015, when he announced his bid for a third term as president and won re-election in July. The UN says more than 400 people have been killed and over 250,000 have fled. And we told you yesterday that the International Criminal Court has confirmed that it will be carrying out preliminary investigations into the one-year-old Burundi crisis. Here's what the ICC prosecutor Fatou Bensouda had to say about the matter.
The crisis in Burundi, more than 430 persons were reportedly killed. At least 3,400 people were arrested, and over 230,000 Burundians were forced to seek refuge in neighboring countries. I will make my decision when there is a factual and legal basis to do so. If the legal criteria are met, I may request ICC judges' authorization to open an investigation. Or, if there is no basis to proceed, I may decide not to open an investigation.
Let's take a closer look at the situation in Burundi. Joining us on the program is a former ICC prosecutor, Mr. Charles Adeogun Phillips. Thank you so much for making our time to speak to us on Network Africa.
Thank you, Tom.
So, my question first is, explain to us how this process works. You heard the ICC prosecutor there. How does this process work?
There are three distinct phases to the commencement of any investigation before the ICC. Under Article 53 of the Rome Statute of the ICC, certain legal thresholds have to be met for the prosecutor to open a formal investigation. So what is discussed to the press is what we call a preliminary examination. Now that consists of phase one, determining whether or not the courts will actually have the temporal jurisdiction to enter to investigate those crimes, whether the courts have the subject jurisdiction, whether those crimes come within the subject matter jurisdiction of the court, in other words, these are crimes that the court has jurisdiction over. But more importantly, phase three concerns admissibility. Now, you understand that the role of the ICC is purely complementary to that of national jurisdictions. So at the admissibility stage of phase three is when the court considers whether or not
the government of Burundi is taking active steps to investigate and prosecute those atrocities. And it is only when it is obvious that the government of Burundi is not taking those steps that the ICC prosecutor would then open a formal investigation. So there are at least three distinctive steps before a formal investigation commences. This is just purely preliminary examination as opposed to an investigation.
That's right, and we both understand that this has been going on for a while. A lot of international observers have actually been saying a lot about the crisis in Burundi. But tell us, how long could an investigation of this magnitude last?
Well, I think the atrocities in Burundi are indeed well documented. I think the activities of the United Nations Office for Human Rights, the Human Rights Rapporteur, has written a report on the atrocities, the alleged atrocities, by the way, in Burundi. So I wouldn't be surprised if this would happen all very quickly within the next 6 months. But of course, we have to bear in mind that the ICC needs the cooperation of the government of Burundi to actually gain access to Bujumbura in the first place to actually investigate these crimes. And that's one of the challenges of international criminal prosecutions, because you do actually need the cooperation, the active cooperation of the state party or the state in question to gain access to these crime scenes and to witnesses and to evidentiary material. That could be a challenge in this case.
A challenge indeed, and you also understand that before now, African Union had wanted to send in some troops to Burundi to help, at least stem the tide of the violence there. And then the question then would be, indeed, like you have asked, how the cooperation of the Burundian government with the ICC. Do you see this play out the way it should, so that this investigation can indeed proceed?
Well, we only have to consider the recent case of Kenya and the ICC, when those two trials against President Uhuru Kenyatta and Vice President Ruto actually collapsed. Why? Because there were difficulties of gaining access into the territory of Kenya to conduct reasonable investigations and obtain evidential material, including witness testimony. So one of the greatest challenges of international criminal justice is clear. You need the cooperation of the state party or the state in question to actually gain access to the territory. In the case of Burundi, if they are not cooperating, it beggars belief that Fatou Bensouda would be able to conduct preliminary examinations successfully in that situation.
So what about the issue of safety? How safe is Burundi for those investigating the violence?
Well, again, your guess is as good as mine. It's the same sort of challenges that peacekeepers often face in conflict situations, and former UN prosecutors like myself had to go into very hostile territory several years ago to conduct investigations. Again, you do need the cooperation of the member states and the state in question, because of course UN police are not necessarily allowed to bear arms or indeed utilize those arms in foreign territory. So it all boils down to how willing the government of Burundi will be to allow these investigations to take place.
A real test for the government of Burundi, indeed. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Absolutely. Charles Adiogun Phillips, a former ICC prosecutor. We're still talking about Burundi. We told you earlier about the crisis, which has lasted for 1 year. About that time now, but in this next report we'll give you a closer look at the plight of those who have been forced to flee the violence to neighboring Tanzania.
Yesterday made it exactly 1 year since violence swept through Burundi. The tensions continue to escalate in the East African country, which has led to the exodus of Burundians. Susanna Mizago has been living in the Nduta refugee camp across the border from Burundi in northwestern Tanzania since February. Mizago explains how she watched anti-government militia in Burundi rip her family apart.
It was midday and the children had come from school. They found us at home. They killed my children and slit my husband's throat.
She's one of around 135,000 Burundian refugees here who have escaped horrors at home. There are new arrivals at the camp every day. They speak of torture, disappearances, massacres of loved ones and neighbors, and even arrests and detention on the border. Violence erupted in Burundi in April last year when President Pierre Nkurunziza announced his bid for a third term, which was opposed by a host of activists, opposition politicians, and some military officers who staged a failed coup in May. Opponents said he was violating the constitution and a peace deal that ended the civil war. But then a court ruled that he could run, and he certainly won his re-election in July. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, The number of Burundian refugees seeking shelter in neighboring countries has reached the 250,000 mark, and numbers could rise even further. With only 38% of the funds needed to help Burundian refugees, the UNHCR and partners are struggling to provide the life-saving services to refugees in camps.
We need to pay attention to the hardship that the refugees are having in the camps in Tanzania. We cannot fail this caseload.
At least 3 armed rebel groups have emerged in Burundi since the political crisis erupted.
We'll be right back after the break. When we come back, we have the latest about the fuel crisis, with the Minister of Petroleum giving Nigerians an apology about the situation.